Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of SciChat. I am Dan Zarella, HubSpot's social media scientist, and like I said, you are listening to SciChat. Now, the way SciChat works, it's more than just a video, more than just a presentation, more than just a webinar, and I think most importantly, it's a community. Right, so the way we started off is we had a Twitter chat and we did a live webinar every Friday, and that was awesome, that was great. But to expand the community a little bit and make the community a little more robust, we moved over to Facebook, right? And so on Facebook, what we have is we have a Facebook group full of lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of really smart marketers like you, who, more importantly than just being smart, are all looking at approaching marketing from a very similar perspective. And they're thinking about marketing, in a very scientific way. They're thinking about approaching marketing and applying the scientific method to marketing, which is really, really awesome and useful. All right, because if you have a question and you want to hear what the data-backed way to approach a question or a problem or an issue you're having in marketing is, it's great just to hop over to the SciChat Facebook group and see what everybody else thinks. And so every week we release the video on a video, on YouTube, publish it to Facebook, release it on Mondays about a different topic, and then throughout the topic we have conversations on Facebook about that topic. So I'm really excited about that. It's been a really interesting change, to move over to Facebook, and we've done a bunch of really interesting videos, or what I think are really interesting videos, of course, because they're me talking, and it's been a lot of fun. So without further ado, I have a bunch of data and a bunch of things to talk about this week, because this week's topic, beyond just being something that I enjoy talking about, which, if you've listened to me talk before, you can kind of get the understanding that I love talking about all kinds of different topics in marketing, and especially marketing data. But more than just enjoying talking about to this week's topic, it's actually one of my favorite things to do. Now that is webinars and presentations. Right? I love the idea of webinars and presentations. In fact, they're probably my favorite kind of content to create. My favorite part of my job is speaking to folks virtually through webinars or traveling around the world and the country to speak to groups of folks large and small. And there's a lot of reasons why I enjoy doing it, and we're gonna get into those things in just a second, but that's what this week's topic is. It is the science of webinars, or the science of presentations. We're going to learn some interesting data that we can use to make our presentations better. Now, if you've heard me speak before, or if you've read any of my books or read most of my blog posts or anything along those lines, you'll know that I call myself a social media scientist. Right? Now, I do this because I go to a lot of marketing conferences, read a lot of marketing books and blogs, and I hear a lot of advice that is, well, for lack of a better word, it's unicorns and rainbows advice, right? Stuff like engage in the conversation, have a personality, be awesome. Stuff it's tough to disagree with, because I'm not going to come here and tell you to punch your customers in the face or anything, but it's generally not based on anything more substantial than what feels right, which is truthy, to borrow Stephen Colbert's phrase. And as social media scientists, and as scientific marketers in general, I think what we do is we go beyond the unicorns and rainbows, superstitions and myth, into the actual data, facts, science, and experimentation behind online behaviors, behind how people behave online, and we learn how, as marketers, we can leverage those behaviors and that data, that science. And I think that's very important understanding that dichotomy in the way marketing can be approached. You can approach it from a purely wishful thinking kind of approach, from a purely sort of black magic approach, from an approach where you do something, you hope it's great, something happens, you don't know what it is, and either it works or it doesn't work, right? And that's certainly a romantic way to approach marketing, and it is, the sort of Hail Mary pass of marketing, if you will. But in my opinion, it is better to shift the odds in your favor. No outcome in marketing is ever guaranteed, but there are certain scientific things that we can do to shift the odds in our favor. And there are huge bodies of research, both new and old, done to help us understand how to shift the likelihood of positive outcomes from our efforts in our favor. And one of those kinds of efforts that we may do is a presentation or a webinar. Right. When we talk about inbound marketing, the traditional inbound marketing storyline involves producing lots of content, which is awesome. And one of the kinds of content that we at HubSpot love to produce, and we love to tell other folks to produce, is webinars. Right? Because it's like you can do a webinar online pretty inexpensively as the presenter. It's often free to go to as an attendee, and you can get a lot of information out of them. You can get a lot of value out of them. Whereas, other than webinars, to hear people speaking, you have to travel, get hotels and flights, and pay for conferences, and fly speakers in, and pay for food. And it gets really expensive and time consuming. Whereas a webinar you can do all at one time. Right, and so that's what this week's topic is. Like I've said, it's webinars. And how do we take the scientific method? How do we take understandings of people, understandings of webinar presentation attendees, and how do we use them to make our presentations better? Right, because it is possible to do this. Right, it is possible to get better at webinars. It's not just, and that's the thing. I go to a lot of marketing conferences. And I've been to a ton over the years, and I wonder. And I've been to conferences outside of the marketing space. Just been the marketing speaker at some industry conference, and I hear a lot of folks speaking, and for the most part, most of the folks that I hear speaking, especially at the bigger conferences, have great content, right? They're in the trenches doing their work, and so they know what they're talking about. They know. What's working for them. They put the time in to the content that they're presenting to you, but they haven't put the time in to how they're presenting it to you. And that is just as important, right? Because if you don't communicate your point effectively, you can have the greatest content in the world, but nobody's going to know or care about what you're saying. And so that's where this quote from Stanislavski comes into play. Stanislavski is a great theater thinker and acting thinker and coach and probably actor himself, I believe. And he one of his most famous quotes is, "There are no small parts, only small actors." What this means is that maybe in your webinar presenting career, your speaking career, you don't consider yourself a speaker. You might not. Right? You may not consider yourself a webinar presenter as a role. That's not a thing you do or a thing you want to be known as, right? But even if that's true, you're still a communicator. Communication is still a very important skill, and live communication, presenting webinars, speaking engagements, that sort of thing, is a very important aspect of any form of communication. All right. And so, one of the biggest mistakes that we can make as presenters, as speakers, is to underestimate the importance, the scale of what we're doing. Okay. Because a really great, and I speak about this from the marketing perspective, and I notice that I'm different than a lot of folks who are going to be listening to me in that I speak to marketers, right? So I'm a marketer speaking to marketers, and so I understand that most marketers are actually speaking to groups of folks who are not necessarily marketers, and so but the same is true. If I get up on stage and I present something to you in an interesting way, I engage you, I make you think about what you're doing, and I make you understand what I'm saying to you, and you go home and you apply what I'm saying to your marketing campaigns or to whatever it is that I'm speaking about, and it works and it helps you, then I've changed your life in some small way. And so that's why I never approach webinar speaking, or I never approach speaking in live as a small part. Even if I'm just talking about how to get more retweets. It's in the grand, sort of lifelong scale of things, it's not that big a deal. I still try not to approach it as a small actor, as Stanislavski, it's a hard name to pronounce, would say. Or that would be the wording he would use. I try to approach it with the requisite preparation and the requisite understanding that speaking is a separate craft. It is a separate ability that needs to be worked separately. It needs to be practiced separately. So if you are a regular speaker, that is probably, I think, in my experience, the most helpful thing to do is to speak regularly, to keep the sort of rust off. But if you're not a regular speaker, don't be afraid to essentially wander around your office speaking to no one, which is actually what I'm doing now since SciChat is recorded. So there are no small parts, only small actors. Please don't think that just because you're presenting a webinar on what may be a niche topic, that it needs to be small. Don't be afraid to let out your more dramatic, more theatrical side, and your passion. Most importantly, or not even most importantly, but that's what everything else is, right? That's what your dramatic side, what theater is based on, is passion and excitement about your topic. And as an example of how, webinar, a seemingly small thing, can actually be a fairly big thing, um, and also by way of explaining how, maybe what my credentials are, what our credentials at HubSpot are in talking about this, we actually hold a Guinness World Record for the world's largest webinar. Right, so 30,000 registrants for this webinar, 10,899 or 90, whatever, attendees, right? Just under 11,000 attendees to one single webinar. Now, if you try to imagine a conference with that many people at it, there are several conferences like in the marketing space or in the tech space and in other spaces where that many people are at it, right? But you typically don't get a single room where everybody's listening to one speaker. You might have major keynotes at a large conference like a Dream Force or South by Southwest, where with all the overflow rooms and everything, you got 11,000 people listening to it or more. But typically speaking, an average speaker is not going to get an opportunity. I've certainly never spoken to a room full of 11,000 people. And that's awesome. That's really amazing. That's only available to us through the power of webinars, through the sort of virtual remote power of webinars, right? And so we should never forget that while webinars, to somebody who's, when people ask me, what my job is, like I'm up at the gym and I'm having a conversation with a guy and they ask me what I do and I tell them my title, and that doesn't really even make a whole lot of sense to somebody if you're not in the industry. And then I get to explain more. I write books, do webinars, blah, blah, blah. And if they say, well, what's a webinar? And I kind of explain it, it sounds kind of silly, right? But it's not, because then you can reach hundreds of people, thousands of people in ways that weren't necessarily possible before. And I think what's most interesting about webinars specifically, as different from other forms of content, because of course you can reach tens of thousands of people with ebooks easily too, but the web is has made us, the web and technologies like TiVo, DVR, have made us a much more asynchronous culture, right? So throughout history, at least recent history, the history of mass media, there have been these points. We just had the anniversary of the JFK assassination. We've had these points in history where I remember when the OJ thing was happening, when the white Bronco was running away from the police. These points in history where everybody remembers where they were because they were sitting around one television watching it, or everybody in a tribe would have sat around and lit the campfire, or everybody in a town would have had a town meeting. And so, but with the web, we're way more desynchronous, we're way more asynchronous, meaning it's very rare these days that we're all experiencing the same thing at the same time. And with the advent of more real-time types of social media like Twitter, those few moments are a lot more special. So if you think about how the football watching experience has changed, when everybody's watching a football game live, and you're tweeting about it, whatever, or even even with a lot of the major shows, people typically tend to time shift them, but webinars are unique in the pantheon of marketing technology and marketing content types that they are synchronous. Right? So you can take an industry, and especially if you're talking about a slightly smaller industry, or sort of a niche part of an industry, and you can get almost a critical mass of people onto a webinar together to create one of those were you there when moments, right? You can create a temporary sort of amalgamation, a temporary community of people who all experiencing the same thing at the same time, and that is exceedingly rare in our modern culture. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons why I personally like webinars so much. I like giving webinars and attending webinars so much, is because, especially really big ones, because I miss a little bit of that synchronicity, a little bit of that sort of community feeling that can come with live events and events that everybody's experiencing all at the same time. In fact, what's a really interesting memory about the Guinness World Record webinar is that the beginning of the webinar it was back in August, the end of August 2011. I had just moved to Las Vegas, so I just and my third book had just been released, and there was an earthquake on the East Coast somewhere, I think between like I want to say Virginia and New York, somewhere in the the upper Mid-Atlantic region, and but because of the whatever the geological makeup of that part of the country, you could feel it all the way in Boston, which is where I was at the time, and New York. I had excuse me, the webinar vendor, the webinar provider was in New York, the operator essentially, and Seth Godin, who was the guest presenter, was also in New York. And they felt it, we felt it, everybody felt it right before the webinar was about to start. And it was really interesting that everybody was experiencing the earthquake, or at least a lot of people in the world were experiencing the earthquake, and at the same time we all started this webinar. So that's how I always remember that I was there when the earthquake happened, because I was there with 11,000 other marketers. And so the research that I did for this, for the webinar stuff, my presentation analysis, was mostly, not all, but mostly based on a survey. And so what I did in the survey, I asked a number of questions. One of the questions I asked was, what makes you want to tweet or blog about a presentation? Now, I didn't specify here webinar versus presentation because, I think there's a lot of crossover, and especially a question like this, there's a ton of crossover here. And so I asked the question in a sort of, one of those paragraph entry fields where people can type in whatever they want. And then to analyze it, what I had to do is sort of correlate all the answers together. Like this one mentioned sharing, like I had to read through thousands and thousands of answers, and this one mentioned sharing, this one mentioned relevance, or this one mentioned the presenter, etc. And of course, sharing was the top most mentioned sort of motivation for tweeting or blogging about a presentation. And it was mostly just people saying that was just the word that people used to describe the act that they were doing, right? And so they said they were sharing. And so you think about it, it's not bragging, it's not anything else. It's sharing. It's like, I'm here getting this value and I want to share this value with other people. And so that's interesting, but it's not particularly useful. I think what the other things that are kind of useful from this slide here in this graph are the second most commonly cited motivation was novelty, right? So this is typically stuff and the fourth one is news, and they're related but different. So novelty was like they're saying something new and different, or different or unique, and the news was like they break news. But there's this similar in that when we're putting together presentations, if we want people to tweet or blog about them, which I think we should, it's a sign that our presentation was good, that we need to think about saying things that are that our attendees can't hear somewhere else, right? We need to think about are we saying something new? Are we saying something different, or are we just rehashing the same thing? That if I'm at a conference and I go to your presentation, you see the same thing everybody else is saying, like I'm not going to come back a second time, and I'm certainly not going to write about you all that much on my blog, or I'm not going to tweet about you all that much, because why would I? I'm just going to go to the person who's the most famous presentation, who's saying the same thing you are, and then tweet about them. Right, and so we really need to think about how do we ensure that our presentation, what we're saying, what we're presenting, is different and is new and is novel, especially when we compare it to other presentations, like if we're at a conference or other folks on a webinar, if we have a multiple person webinar call. Another one you had is relevance. That's basically like, I tweeted or blogged about it because I knew that what the presenter was saying was something that the rest of my audience would be interested in hearing. And so that's interesting in that you need not necessarily just to think about what your audience is interested in, but think about their audiences. Are there things that you can say that your audience's audience will be interested in? And in marketing, that's a little easier than in other fields because, as a marketer, the people that I'm talking to who are also marketers, they probably have Twitter accounts where they're followed by other marketers, right? But if you're in an industry that's, sells something else, then you need to think about, how do I talk about the industry in such a way that potentially the end consumer is also interested, right? And so maybe don't make your whole presentation like that, but think about dropping in a couple of sound bites that appeal to your audience's audience. Another one that I think is interesting is number 5 on the list is the presenter. People said that if they liked the presenter, if they heard of the presenter, if they were a fan of the presenter, if the presenter was particularly energetic, passionate, funny, witty, smart, whatever, or was not that good, was the opposite of any of those things, right? And so a lot of it has to do with making your audience like you, or making your audience excited by your passion and your energy, right? And that's not something that we think about. Like when I was describing the problem that I see in a lot of conferences before, in that people often have great content, but don't spend a ton of time worrying about the presentation aspect of things. Don't work on the craft of being a presenter. Don't work on the craft of communicating. Uh, that's where it boils down to, because you can have the best content in the world if you can't get the audience on your side, if you can't engage the audience, entertain them, whatever your particular tack is, excite them or enrage them, that could work too. But if you can't do that, if you can't make an emotional connection with your audience, then it's going to be really hard for you to get them to tweet or blog about your presentation, because they're just not going to be all that excited and motivated to. And then, you have this two past presenter. You have reputation is a big one too, and that's basically like, oh, I want my followers or my blog readers to know that I'm at this super cool presentation, listen to this super cool presenter, right? And so if you can, as a presenter, give some sort of exclusive information, or if you compliment your audience in a way that, through your releasing of information, like special sort of back channel, behind the scenes kind of information, that's something that people will share, because it'll help enhance their reputation as somebody who's at the right events, who's listening to the right speakers, who knows the right things. And then, sort of sandwiching this reputation thing on the graph, you have people there and people not there. And that's, I think, that's the last point I want to make about this slide, is that when I asked people what makes them want to tweet or blog about a presentation, there were these two competing motivators. Sometimes they were even in the same answer. But one was like, because the people there, meaning if I'm at an event and there's like a hashtag for an event, if there's like a community that's sprung up about an event, and that's what an event really is, it's networking and all this sort of stuff. And then I want to tweet or blog about what I think about what's happening on stage, because that way I can get involved in conversations about this content, about this topic, with other people that are sitting around me, and I can kind of contribute to that conversation. Or I understand that other people in my industry, my friends, my followers, my audience, may not be able to have been to have attended this particular presentation or webinar, so I want to share with the people that are not here. Right. And so that's an interesting one, because you need to think, as a presenter, how do I, both enhance the fact, how do I bring light to the fact that there's a great community these people are a part of, because they're all in the same place at the same time, talking about and interested in the same things, and remind them that there are people who are not here that also shouldn't be forced to miss out just because they want to be stingy and not tweet, my information out. Right. And so think about all these different kinds of motivators as you're putting your presentation together, as you're practicing your ability to present. Now, this is not survey data here. What this is several years ago at HubSpot, we were just starting to do these really, really huge webinars. Like, we were just starting to do like multiple thousands and getting over tens of thousands of attendees and registrants to our webinar. And one of the really early ones that we did was called FB Sci, or Facebook Sci. It was the first Facebook Science webinar we did. Science, a Facebook webinar that we did. And we were moving around webinar like platforms a lot, vendors a lot. And a lot of them couldn't handle necessarily the volume of attendees that we were driving, or sometimes we weren't necessarily prepared for, like we weren't expecting the reaction we were going to get. And so what you had happen here is that the blue line represents the number of tweets that were happening about this particular webinar, and then the orange line represents the number of webinar logins, essentially, per second. And so basically what we see happen is that right as the webinar was about to start at about 1 p.m., there was a crash and people couldn't log in. But the blue line, actually, of tweets, people talking about the presentation, spiked right then, because everybody's like, oh my God, I can't get in, blah, blah, blah. And it took like 15 minutes. So the webinar actually didn't start 15, 20 minutes late because of the technological problems that we had. And so we kept going. And what's funny is that it ended up trending still, right? There was no great downtick. People didn't say, oh, I can't get in, get sick, and turn away. People understand that stuff happens. There are technical glitches. Sometimes you will misspeak. People get that. You're a human. Nobody expects you to be perfect and be a robot, right? And so when something happens that's unexpected in a presentation, whether it's live or in a webinar, don't freak out. Be clear as you can with your audience, communicate with them, be transparent, but don't freak out, because people understand that mistakes happen and it's not that big a deal. It's not the end of the world. So just keep moving on. Also, during that webinar, I did an experiment. I used to use a lot more, and I do sometimes still use takeaway slides, which is a slide that, like, like I'll present some data on a slide or a series of data to make a point, and then I'll just I'll have a takeaway slide that's under 140 characters, and it's basically just telling you what you just learned in like a tweetable soundbite, right? And so in that presentation that I did, in that Facebook Science presentation that I did, 22% of the slides in my presentation were takeaway slides, right? I use a lot of slides per minute when I do my full hour presentations, and 22% of the slides that I used were takeaways, but only 86% of the tweets about the webinar referenced the takeaways, the tweetable takeaways that were on those slides, which means that takeaways are interesting and they're useful to make sure that you may go back to a concrete thing, but shoving the exact wording down people's throats or being super explicit about it, maybe shouldn't have taken up 22% of what I was doing. So experiment with these takeaways, but try to aim. I would say aim for maybe at most 10%, 15% of your slides being these takeaway slides. And then when I looked at all the tweets in general about the webinar with the hashtag FBSci, I found that a full 27%, almost 30% of them were RTs, right? Were retweets but used the RT syntax. And then another 5% of them were RTs but used the via syntax, right? The such and such and such a via Danzarella. And so what is interesting here is that if you're doing a good job as a presenter, people don't always necessarily want to take the time away from paying attention to you to sit down and write a tweet. So sometimes you're just going to retweet what other people have said, especially if it's spot on or if other people took the time away. So what I experimented with after this is plugins for PowerPoint I could write the tweets, put them in the notes section of the PowerPoint presentation such that when I got to a specific slide, that tweet would be posted to my Twitter account. And I would tell people that I was going to do this, like, hey, every time I get to a takeaway slide, it's going to get posted at Danzarella or at HubSpot or whatever, and you can just go to that account and retweet it there, right? And that's helpful sometimes because people don't want to think that they're going to have to take away time. They're going to have to, start ignoring you essentially. And then another experiment I did throughout this presentation is when I do live presentations, I'll ask people to raise their hands to answer various questions. And in a live presentation, it's interesting because you can see the answers, right? But in a webinar, you can't see when people are raising their hands. And I think this is kind of funny to do, but it's also a really interesting test. And so I asked people, I said, okay, raise your hand at this question to answer this question. Raise your hand now or raise your hand now for this answer, A and B, whatever. And tweet at me to tell me that you have done this. Right, and so what I found is that I was able to look through the people who did this and match their genders. And most content, most webinars, most presentations that I do because I'm a marketer tend to have more women in the audience, just because the marketing field. If you went to school for marketing, you'll probably understand this. The marketing field is mostly women. Communications, I think, in general tends to skew more female than male, and so normally most of my presentations do skew more female than male. But men seem to be a little bit more likely to have complied and told me about complying with my hand raising request. And I don't know what this means from a gender study perspective, but what I think our takeaway should be is you should know your audience, right? And you should understand who's in your audience. That way you can speak to them and you may be able to motivate them in different ways. And then when I took those different breakdowns that I did where, people who tweeted the takeaway in green, people who had retweeted in orange, people who told me they raised their hands in red, and then just the overall in blue, and I looked at the average number of followers of people who tweeted about the webinar, the people who retweeted had the highest number of followers, which tells me that of all these particular tactics, straight up asking for things, using takeaway slides, it was retweeting that was the most important one. So if you're going to experiment with one of these techniques, experiment with the technique that worked, that got the highest number of followers first, and that was essentially retweeting. So definitely try. Like when we do webinars at HubSpot, we generally have somebody on our Twitter account monitoring, and so maybe they can be typing out the takeaways as the presentation's going on, and then you can just tell people that you're doing that so they can go over and follow that account and retweet it when they want to share something that you've just said. And then, of course, after a lot of webinars, what we'll do is we'll take the slide deck and we'll share them to SlideShare, right? Because a lot of people always ask, oh, can I get the slides for that presentation? And I'm not a big fan of that because there's two different skills in making a slide presentation, right? Like you can use PowerPoint to make two different kinds of documents. One kind of document is for presenting along with a voice, and those kind of slides are best with very few words, and we'll get into some of the design stuff in 1 second, but they're very different than a slide share or a deck that is built for consumption outside of a presentation, i.e. without words alongside of it, without somebody speaking. And those look very, very different. So I don't love the idea of sharing slides after presentation because it's not going to be as good as the original presentation was. And if I'm going to share something with you in a slide format, it's going to be wholly different than what I'm going to share with you if you get to hear me talking alongside of it. But when you do share things to SlideShare, I did some analysis on SlideShare slides. As the number of slides in a presentation increases, there does seem to also be some concurrent increase in the number of views. So if you are sharing stuff to SlideShare, try to make it as robust as possible. The more slides in a presentation, the more views those presentations get. And because I think that's because of an interesting rule of thumb that I've heard from several different people, Nancy Duarte and Guy Kawasaki, for instance, one thought per slide. Don't try to cram your entire presentation into as few slides as possible. Actually, you're not charged by the slide. It doesn't take any more time to create more slides than it does to create fewer slides. And flipping through slides quickly is not a bad thing. It's a good thing because it allows you to organize your thoughts a little bit better. And actually, when you get to know a presentation really, really well, and you can start to lead into the next slide before you click over, it actually looks super professional, super slick, and people like it, right? And so one thought per slide. That's going to mean you're going to have more slides than you would have naturally, but that's fine. Don't be afraid to have more slides, and don't limit if you're organizing a presentation, or limit people by time. Don't say give me 10 slides. You have 10 minutes or whatever you want it to be. All right, one thought per slide, and that means no bullet points. Bullet points are for read documents, right? So your audience can read faster than you can talk, and I talk really fast, and that's still true for me. And so don't use bullets. Right? Because all a bullet list is going to do on a slide is going to make you want to read it, but your audience is going to be reading it ahead of you, and then they're going to get bored and they're going to stop listening to you. No bullets. So if you're doing a presentation, if you're making a presentation in PowerPoint, or I don't even know what the Mac one is, whatever, but power presentation or something probably. But if you're making a presentation for speaking for an actual, you're making a slide deck for a presentation, don't use bullets. The 30-point rule. This will help you hold on to these other rules easily as well. Don't use any font under 30 points on a slide. It's going to be really hard to see. Some graphs may be an exception to this rule because you may want to pack a little bit more information into a graph, so you may have to use a slightly smaller font size. But typically try to stay over 30 points. That way everybody can see it. But then additionally, it really keeps it to a simple slide. It keeps it as one idea per slide thing. It's hard to do big big list of bullet points in more than in 30 point, and so it keeps you to nice looking, simple, well organized, well designed slides. No noise. Try to remove as much stuff from your presentation, from your slide as possible. There should be the absolute bare minimum required to get your point across on each slide. And if there is something on your slide that you can't take away, but it's not speaking to the one point on the slide, that means you have two ideas in one slide, and you should make a second slide or a third slide and a fourth slide. Right? So really edit ruthlessly and take as much stuff out of your slides as you can. And if it's something that you really want to have in the presentation, put it on the next slide, and don't be afraid to use more slides. And then use strong imagery. Stay away from these cliches like I have here with the shaking hands thing, right? Because all that is visual noise. Nobody really assigns any sort of serious meaning to that anymore. So think about imagery that is unexpected, that will help you get your point across in a more nuanced way. If you want to talk about relationships between two companies or between partners or whatever, think about the relationships specifically and what does it actually mean before these two organizations, these two people. Don't just okay, it's a partnership, so I'm just gonna have two dudes shaking hands, because people are just gonna tune that out. They're gonna be blind to that awful stock photo cliche, and they're not going to use it. So think about how you can sort of surprise and delight with your imagery. Spend some extra time if you're using stock photography in selecting it and selecting stuff that is a little more unexpected. Something that if you saw it, you'd be like, oh, hey, that's an interesting take. That's a different take on that. And then, in the survey, we found a bunch of key findings. And so one of those, in my research in general, I found several key findings. One of those is the use of takeaways. I do like using takeaways. I would just, don't overuse them. I would generally recommend that you aim around 10%, but as always, experiment with that number. Experiment with 20% takeaway slides. Experiment with 5% takeaway slides. And again, what a takeaway slide is essentially is a tweetable soundbite version of the information you just gave people. On a slide, it's a bit more text than I would generally recommend. So again, experiment with it and see if it works. So that is the end of this week's SciChat presentation. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope to see you talking about presentations and stuff this week in the Facebook group. As always, if you have questions about marketing, about scientific, applying the scientific method to marketing, please don't hesitate to ask them in the group. I or somebody else, some other member of the community will answer you. And as always, have a great week. Thanks for coming, and talk to you again next week.